Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, we'd like to welcome you to today's extended day-ahead market congestion revenue allocation phase 2 stakeholder working group meeting. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I'm joined by Milos Bosanev, James Lynn, Hillary Staver, George Angelides, John Anders, and Philip Ross. Just a few friendly reminders here before we get started. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. The meeting is intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. So please keep your comments professional and respectful today. Also, please try to keep your comments and questions succinct so that we're able to hear from everyone. You can access closed captioning on the bottom left hand of your screen, and the Inteller Transparency Viewer on the bottom right hand of your screen will be available in a moment. Be sure to refresh before viewing the Transparency Viewer. We welcome and look forward to your engagement and participation in today's meeting. Some instructions for raising your hand. The raised hand icon is directly at the bottom of your WebEx screen. If you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device to join the queue. And please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making any comments. And please make sure to pause a few seconds before speaking. Sometimes there's a delay with WebEx and it can cut off your introduction. You may also send your comments and questions via chat to all panelists. If you need any technical assistance today during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer in Teller Events. For today's call, Milos is going to be taking us through some meeting objectives and an introduction. Afterwards, we'll discuss design concepts, and then we'll wrap up with next steps. So with that, I will turn things over to Milos to get us started.
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another working group on phase 2 of the EDAM congestion revenue enhancement that looks at designs post-EDAM go live, either near-term enhancements or more durable structure to a design for congestion revenue allocation. I'll talk a little bit here just about the meeting objectives and then give an overview of what we'll cover in more detail. But we'll start by reviewing some of the stakeholder comments from the April 17th stakeholder working group meeting. We received comments on May 1st, and I'll cover some of the themes from those comments. And then as we get into the different design concepts, we'll review some more pointed comments on those individual concepts. But the goal today is to review those comments and discuss them in the context of the different designs that we're looking at. We then want to also talk through the individual designs that we introduced last time. We want to continue that discussion on those concepts at a more granular level, informed by the stakeholder comments, and delve a little bit deeper in trying to shape feasibility of those concepts that were introduced. And then I encourage you all, as we go through the discussion today, please share your feedback, questions. All questions are welcome, and that will help us kind of continue to refine those concepts, design concepts, and establish a more structured and defined proposals that we can then eventually take into an issue paper and a straw proposal. So with that, what we'll do is I'll provide a little bit of an overview again of where we are in the effort and the working groups. If we have any new folks that are just joining this working group meeting, a bit of a reminder of where we are. And then we'll delve into individual concepts that we brought in from the last meeting. We'll review those, delve a little bit deeper. I expect, and we'll cover this in next steps as well, I expect that in the next series of working groups, we'll dedicate individual sessions to 1 or 2 concepts so that we can have a deeper dive into each one of these. But we wanted at this stage to continue to review all the concepts that have been introduced and review the stakeholder feedback that we've received to date. We go to the next slide. Just starting with a bit of an overview of where we've been, and particularly the last working group meeting, in case we have any people that are just joining us at this stage of the working group discussions. We started the working groups back in December of last year. We've had a series of working groups focusing primarily on shaping the design principles. I think we've established a good quorum among stakeholders on the initial design principles that we would evaluate against the different concepts as we break them down more granularly. And starting with the April 17th working group, we started then into the next stage of the working group discussions, focusing on introduction of different design concepts. These are not yet detailed design proposals, but these are different concepts that we've introduced to test out stakeholder feedback and input and help us shape viability of these and make sure that they ultimately address what we're trying to address with the initiative. So the working group on April 17th kind of commenced that next stage of substantive design concept discussions on congestion revenue allocation design. We had the Energy Authority TEA present some of their near-term and quick win and as well as a long-term concept for consideration. And the ISO also had the opportunity to introduce 3 different potential design concepts or a spectrum of concepts for discussion and consideration, and we received feedback on all of these on May 1st. We also, at the last working group, started discussing what the approach for managing congestion underfunding risk, to the extent that under any one of these proposals, there is not enough congestion revenues that accrue to be able to fully pay out the congestion hedges that may be due. But that's the overview of the last workshop. And if we go to the next slide, in this working group today, we're going to delve deeper into each one of those concepts that we discussed last time. I do want to acknowledge here some of the stakeholder comment themes from the comments that were due on the first workshop. Those comments came in May 1st or thereabout. And as we go into each one of the design concepts, we'll reflect a little bit more granularly and we'll highlight some of the more granular comments on the individual design concepts. But I wanted to start here just acknowledging the breadth of stakeholder feedback. We received 16 sets of stakeholder comments on the last workshop. And I'm certainly excited about that because it indicates the level of interest and a lot more stakeholders now that we've put some more concrete concepts out. I think it gives an opportunity for more stakeholders to react and share really helpful and informative perspectives. I think this is the most comments that we've gotten in phase 2 of the initiative thus far, I think more than in individual comments on the principles. So that's a great sign to see, and I encourage you all to continue submitting comments and reacting to the concepts as we continue to evaluate them and break them down more granularly and shape the viability of these. Some of the comment themes that I'll highlight here, and again, we'll go deeper into it when we cover each one of the concepts, but across the comments, there was broad support for design concept number 3, which provided for a common simultaneous feasibility test process that incorporated CRRs, congestion revenue rights that exist in the CAISO balancing area, but also incorporating transmission rights into a common simultaneous feasibility test process that ultimately yields or identifies congestion revenue entitlement. So broad support for that concept from the commenters thus far. There were also a broad set of concerns that folks identified with concept number 2. There was some level of support of continuing to evaluate concept number 2, but there was also a large amount of stakeholders that raised some concern with concept number 2, which is a design under which we would establish some historical baseline for establishing different congestion revenue entitlements for CRRs and note rights that fit within that baseline compared to those rights that may arise after that historical baseline. And the idea behind concept number 2 was to recognize the continued historical use of each other's systems and the parallel flow effects associated with these, but try to bound for lack of a better term, the parallel flow congestion revenue allocation or the congestion revenue that arises as a result of parallel flows, bound that congestion revenue allocation between the participating balancing areas. And one way to bind that or limit that is through establishment of a historical baseline of rights that were established before a particular time frame, that those could receive a broader congestion revenue entitlement, recognizing that those rights were in existence and use prior to establishment of that deadline. We also received kind of divided perspectives on concept number 1 that was introduced by the ISO, which effectively introduced a design for allocation of congestion revenues based on cleared balance schedules. So it looked at registered out transmission rights as well as CRRs from source to sink, and effectively provided the congestion revenue allocation, including the parallel flow component for cleared balance schedules. So it still requires the scheduling and clearing the market in order to receive a allocation of congestion revenues. And stakeholders were divided on this concept almost evenly. There was some that supported it, some more tacitly than others. There was a bit stronger opposition, but as we'll cover it a bit later, there was stakeholders on both sides of considering the merit and at least the durability of this type of a design that we'll cover a bit later. TA also provided a presentation, and stakeholders as well similarly had divided perspectives on different design concepts that were introduced by TEA. There were some near-term concepts or quick wins, as it was termed, as well as a long-term design, and we'll cover that in a bit as well. I do want to highlight as well that we heard from a couple of stakeholders, at least two stakeholders in the last set of comments, suggesting slowing down the cadence on this particular working group structure, slowing down a little bit to take maybe into account the practical effects of the phase one design that just went into practical operation with the EDAM launch on May 1st. And I think we recognize there's a lot of things going on, a lot of different efforts, aside from folks trying to implement EDAM and accustom themselves to participation in that wider EDAM market now. And we do recognize that there's a lot on the plate. We try to shift a little bit some of the working groups, as we'll touch in the next steps, to give a little bit more space, at least for the month of May. But I think we're certainly open with stakeholder feedback to continue to work on the cadence of these and evaluate the best path forward. I think there's room also, as we go through our first month of EDAM operation here by the end of May, that it may give us also some helpful information that we can bring back to this group and see how the phase one design is working, and does that provide us any insights into where we may want to go on a long-term basis. So these are the general themes, and as I said, as we go into the individual design concepts, I'll more granularly kind of highlight some of the stakeholder perspectives that we saw, as well as share some of the ISO perspectives on these. Go to the next slide. So what we'll do next is go step by step, or at least conceptual design by conceptual design, the same ones that were introduced at the last meeting, take stock of the stakeholder comments, share some potential additional, more granular detail on how to make the individual concepts viable. And then I think we'll also stop for stakeholder feedback and questions along the way. But before we jump into that, just again, want to remind us of where we are today, or what the design for congestion revenue allocation in EDAM is that went live on May 1st. Just because, again, it may remind us of what it is and allow us a good contrast as we evaluate the different design concepts. But in the phase one of the initiative that we started last year, we evaluated a design that particularly tried to address the parallel flow congestion revenue component and how that's allocated between EDAM balancing areas. And so the phase one design that's currently in place in the EDAM that launched on May 1st is a transitional design, and that's why we're looking at alternative designs, near-term enhancements and a long-term design to move away from this transitional design. But that transitional design established effectively that congestion revenues that result from internal transmission constraints within an EDAM balancing area, those congestion revenues are allocated to that balancing area where the constraint is located. That was always the case with the EDAM design. That's the case with the EIM design. But the new component that got added last year with the phase one design is that we more specifically try to address the parallel flow congestion revenue allocation concerns and providing a more complete hedge for transmission customers exercising their rights. And so that new component in phase one that's currently in effect as well is that congestion revenues that result from the parallel flows associated with the exercise of source to sink firm O transmission rights through a balanced self-schedule, they're allocated to the EDAM balancing area where those transmission rights are exercised. And again, that added the component that it allowed the EDAM entity to provide a more complete congestion hedge to parties that exercise their transmission rights through a self-schedule. The design today is that the EDAM entity is the one that receives those congestion revenues and ultimately sub-allocates them under the terms of their open access transmission tariff. And we have both Pacificor and Portland General that have gone through that process and have established under their tariffs a FERC-approved design for the sub-allocation of the congestion revenues. So that's the current design that's currently in place, and just thought that would be helpful as we contrast it and evaluate potential places where we could go with the design, moving away from this phase one design that's currently transitional. Let's pause here just before I jump in, because in the next sections we're going to go design concept by design concept, review some of the comments, review potential modifications or answering some of the comments to those designs, some additional more granular details to that maybe improve viability. And I'll pause after each one of those to take some questions, but just wanted to test here before we get into individual concepts if there's any starting questions at this point.
Looks like we have a question from Dan Williams. Go ahead, Dan.
Hey, Milos, Dan from TEA. So just before we get into talking through some of the concept things and just kind of here on the setup, I was just curious if others have expressed interest in stepping up with their own ideas, concepts, potential alternatives, things in that direction. And I ask that just because going into these working groups and in TEA, myself offering to put some things together, kind of our expectation was that others were going to do the same. We work with LSEs and others in all three organized markets in the West. And in all the time that we spend showing up in work groups in the SPP context, there's kind of this expectation that folks will show up with their ideas and kind of work together to move things forward in thinking about proposals and concepts just broadly as like what could work, what could be good for the market, not what's best for your specific company or what would kind of tilt the table in your direction. And so I went into developing concepts, ideas, whatever we want to call them, just sort of with the thought that, hey, here's some things that a lot of us have talked about in the past. Let's get them out on the table and talk through them. And I appreciate all the time that folks took in submitting comments and feedback and such. But I am still hopeful that if there are others out there who have some ideas and things that we could pick up and take a look at, that they'd step up as well. And so I guess that to wrap that up is just a curiosity of if others have expressed that interest or kind of where things might go from here with just sort of the realm of the possible that's on the table.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think we've noted at the last meeting we're invite folks to present to the extent that there's any different concepts or designs that they want to consider or variations to what they may have heard. We certainly invite stakeholders to do that. We haven't gotten any additional takers explicitly yet, but I think through the written comment, I think stakeholders did try, at least on some of the concepts, to provide some feedback and some consideration of what could be considered to the extent that there are any variations, and I'll highlight that as we go through the different concepts. But certainly stakeholders are welcome to suggest whether, again, they feel comfortable doing it like this, presenting in front of the big crowd a design concept, or even through their written comment, any variations that should be considered. We certainly welcome that.
Thanks. That's good feedback. And just before we get into kind of your overview of the stuff that we put forward. For anybody that's kind of new on the coming into this call, what we suggested out there are ideas that are very contextual. Tried to present them as completely as possible, and tried to restate them in written comments that we submitted in this last round, and hopefully those are kind of a good standalone way of not having to go back through all the presentation material. But I do hope that folks can look at those and think if something is objectionable or you have a different idea of maybe where to take them, not to just dismiss them out of hand, but to think like what could be a bridge to a long-term design, what could help make incremental improvements to where we are today, and really just step up and make those known. So if there are some other things we should be considering, that we can do so.
Thank you, Dan. I think we have another.
We have another hand from Alan Mex. Go ahead, Alan.
Hi, Alan Meck, PG&E. I just wanted to give a quick response to Dan that just because we're not necessarily coming forward with ideas, it doesn't mean that our ideas aren't out there. Internally, I'll just give you a peek behind the curtain. We had actually been talking about a design concept that ended up being pretty similar to what CAISO ended up proposing with design concept number 3. And so we're just hopeful that we can flesh that out, and maybe that'll be long-term durable design. So good job, CAISO.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Alan. And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time.
Okay. Okay, well, let's go then to the next slide. And like I said, we'll go through this presentation. We'll go through each one of the design concepts that were introduced. Dan, after I go through some of these slides, I'll certainly yield the floor to you if you wanted to respond to any of the comments that you read on the concepts that you presented, or add anything to that. But here, what I'm going to try to do in my own words and based on my own read of the comments, share some of the perspectives and a bit of the recap on the concept. So if we go to the next slide, there we go. So just starting point and a brief summary of some of the suggested design concepts that TEA introduced at the last meeting. There were some near-term or quick win suggestions. One of those concepts was a point-to-point OAT transmission service carve-out, under which effectively the transmission provider, the EDAM entity, and the market would effectively carve out point-to-point rights from the market or allow pathway to carve those out. And the resulting congestion revenues that accrue would ultimately effectively not be affected by those rights, or would not, by carving those rights out, the congestion revenues would not flow to those rights, and therefore any remaining congestion revenues that accrue would be allocated to the remaining transmission customers and NITS transmission customers. And the thought was that could remove that self-scheduling incentive, since point-to-point transmission rights generally are used to wheel through or export from a transmission provider system. But that was one concept that was introduced. By carving out point-to-point transmission service, it may be allowed a better way or more congestion revenues to flow to protect network customers, which is something that Dan noted was a key consideration. Another concept that was introduced was maybe a more complete hedge for 6NN OAT transmission rights. These are secondary network service transmission rights, or network non-firm as well transmission, but particularly for imports of the 6NN transmission rights, if those transmission rights could be registered with the market operator, similar to firm transmission OAT transmission rights, that if those 6NN transmission rights could also be registered and exercised through the market through a self-schedule, they could also receive a more complete hedge. Those load serving entities and scheduling coordinators that are scheduling using those transmission rights and import, they could also receive a congestion hedge, not just the firm rights. And that's another way of achieving, I think, the goals that Dan was putting forward of protecting load from exposure to these congestion potential charges under the design. There were other suggestions as well within Dan's presentation on enabling broader intertie bidding as well as the EDAM interties as a way of further also reducing self-scheduling and improving liquidity in the market. The TA presentation also had a long-term suggestion to a long-term design, which is a CRR-like product for EDAM balancing areas that entails some financial entitlements for those that hold transmission rights and don't need to schedule them, but you need to hold those transmission rights. It provided for direct settlement with the rights holder, and then also had a consideration of syncing the design ultimately with the SEAMS transactions framework that may emerge with other markets that are in the West. We go to the next slide. I'll just do a brief overview of some of the stakeholder comments that we received on this front. There were, I think, 16 commenters altogether that were received on the presentation from the 17th. There were a few of them, I think 7 or so, that didn't comment on the design concepts, but there were 9 entities that did provide some level of comment, either superficial or a little bit more in-depth, but some level of support or opposition to the TA concepts that were introduced. The entities that expressed some level of support provided that general support for some of the concepts introduced, that these should be considered as especially considering that the Western grid is evolving. That includes point-to-point carve-outs, broadening intertie bidding, and I think some even noted enabling virtual bidding within the market. A couple of commenters also expressed support for the long-term concept, recognizing it ultimately as a version of where we want to be down the line in a CRR-like design on a long-term basis. The entities that commented and expressed opposition did so particularly, I think, focused more on the near-term concepts on the ground that generally these exacerbate some of the congestion issues or the inefficiency incentives that the phase 1 design that's currently in place may have. If we go on the next slide. So I'll share some of the ISO perspectives as we've evaluated and considered some of these concepts introduced by TEA, at least at this stage, based on how they were described originally. But in terms of some of our perspectives on the near term or the quick value design concept, again, the thought is that carving out transmission as a solution to the congestion revenue allocation, to us, it seems that it exacerbates the congestion issues and the congestion costs and not directly relevant to the scope of the initiative. I think it has wider implications of a point-to-point carve-out design has wider implication than just the congestion revenues and how congestion revenues are allocated. That's been a focus of other efforts and other comments at FERC and protests as a separate aspect of design, seeking carve out of transmission rights. While it may have some effect here on congestion revenues if you do that, but I think the breadth of that impact is much wider than just congestion revenues. And again, it can exacerbate some of the congestion issues that are more directly relevant to this effort. The extension of the phase 1 design to 6NN transmission rights, including if it's just for those that are importing, which already have to be self-scheduled, but I think it exacerbates and perpetuates some of those incentives and I think opens the door for hedging for non-firm transmission rights, which is not the norm in the industry, that non-firm transmission rights can receive that type of a hedge. It also creates certain implementation complications on our end of registering and then exercising and associating 6NN transmission rights with a congestion with a contract reference number that can be exercised. There's a number of implications for priorities that come into play that commingle the issues at that point in time. But I think at a principal level, I think we see challenges with extending the more complete congestion hedge in phase one design to non-firm transmission rights and exacerbating some of the potential issues and asymmetries that may exist between the CAISO allocation and allocation with EDAM entity. There's also, I think, suggestions of expansions of intertie bidding and enabling virtual bidding. On the intertie bidding aspect, again, we think that's a little bit outside of the scope because it has wider implications. There's a rationale for why broader intertie bidding is not a commonplace in EDAM at the launch, at least. The EDAM does expand intertie bidding beyond what's in the EIM because designated network resources can bid at the interties, but by and large, it's a decision, at least at this stage, for the EDAM entities, whether they decide to enable broader intertie bidding on their interties or not. And you know, this has an ancillary impact to congestion revenues, but it's got wider implications than just this initiative. And we are going to look at different aspects of intertie bidding and expansion of intertie bidding within the intertie schedule enhancements initiative, and that's the better place, I think, where some of these concepts on intertie bidding can be discussed. Because ultimately, within this effort, we're looking at, you know, the incentives for improved and more liquidity within the context driven by congestion revenue allocation, but expansion of intertie bidding has wider implications than just that. And then enable virtual bidding, which I think is a number of commenters noted that they support, or at least is a derivation of some of the concepts introduced by TEA is, you know, I think virtual bidding is an optional feature of the EDAM at the start, that each EDAM entity can elect whether to enable virtual bidding within its balancing area or not. But we've also committed at FERC that after 2 years of operational experience, we would undertake an initiative that relooks at that effort and considers the nature and extent of virtual bidding within the footprint. And so eventually here down the line, that effort is going to be undertaken, and we're looking at what the impacts may be in the EDAM through this operational experience without virtual bidding elected by the BAs, and that can inform that future policy on enabling virtual bidding. But we didn't think that this was the place to decide that within the context of congestion revenue allocation. In terms of perspectives on the long-term design, I think this has a number of similarities with the design concept number 3 that the ISO also introduced, and we didn't coordinate on these presentations beforehand, but I think it has a lot of similarities, and hopefully I think TA acknowledged that, and I think we can keep considering that concept number 3 in relation to the long-term design that TA introduced as well. But the concept number 3 that we introduced last meeting incorporates OAT rights and CRRs into a common financial entitlement mechanism. It does introduce a simultaneous feasibility test, which wasn't an explicit piece of the TA proposal, but I think ultimately where it lands is there's a mechanism for establishing financial entitlements based on rights that are held. You know, the other piece I think we wanted to note is you know, the design that we're working on right now should not be held up or be dependent upon ultimately potential future SEAM transactions frameworks that may be established between EDAM and other markets. I think we want to focus on establishing the design for the EDAM that works, and then to the extent that there are other extraneous factors that come down the line, we can consider those effects, but we don't think we should hold that up for potential SEAMs arrangements that may need to be made or may be considered down the line. Let me see, do we have any more slides on this? Okay, so I think, so I'll pause here. These are some of our perspectives, some of the summary of the comments. Certainly, Dan, if you're up for it, if you wanted to share your perspectives based on what you read, and maybe if you're interested in responding to any of the comments that you read, I know, you know, certainly there's an opportunity for that. So feel free to jump in and share your perspectives. I think we can continue considering some of these concepts as we're going through the working groups, but just want to give you the opportunity to share your perspectives.
Yeah, looks like Dan has his hand raised. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Milos, and I think it's a very fair representation of things, and appreciate that, and also to appreciate the feedback and such that came in through comments. Um, I definitely do, and we definitely do agree that that long-term design concept is a 100% where we want to be. I mean, there was a strong handful of us who were trying to get there before any of the EDAM tariffs were filed, and we're hoping that we could make that really a the highest priority among, I guess, many high priorities, but understand that things take time, and so the part of the understanding that's going to take some time to get to that long-term design concept was trying to think through, like, what could be done in the interim period that isn't perfect, that has trade-offs, just like all the current design elements have trade-offs, and could maybe put things on a little bit more of an even footing, and push in the direction of having more competitive outcomes in the market. And you know, like I said before, just ideas. Welcome others to kind of share some thoughts on things that they think could be adjusted or tweaked within the current design as we work towards the long-term concept. Um, I did want to ask quickly, though, also, one of the other things I've been mentioning is just the opportunity to think about disaggregating the EDAM load aggregations into smaller sub areas, and just whether that was something that the CAISO has looked at. And it's not that that's necessarily a congestion revenue allocation thing. It's just one of those things that would allow entities, when engaging with EDAM, and especially when importing as a load serving entity, to have a little bit more direct linkage between the transactions that they're doing and where their sort of load exposure and generation exposure is showing up. And I'm sure Guillermo and his team are, looking at market results and seeing what's coming out. But just in some of the different times where I've been, popping up the Skittles map, there's been some pretty strong separation between the north and south areas in PAC East that, to me, seem to call for at least looking at whether it would make sense to establish some different ways of pricing load, and by doing that, give entities an opportunity to kind of point their megawatts in a direction that makes sense for them.
Hey, Dan, on the last point, I'm sure that is something that Guillermo is looking into, and probably it'd be something that'll be continued discussion, but as you kind of indicated here, it's not necessarily related to the congestion element that we're discussing here. And you're basically talking about low granularity. So that would be a different initiative and a different topic that would have to be addressed to all the stakeholders. It's James Lynn from ISO.
That's very fair, James, and I guess that goes for a number of the things that we put out on the table. That, yeah, they aren't specifically congestion revenue allocation within a narrow scope, but they are things that impact how entities engage with and are exposed to price risk, and that is what congestion revenue allocation, to me, is all about. So it is hard at times sometimes to put different aspects of the market into different buckets, and this is certainly one where it feels like there's an opportunity to chip away at things from multiple different areas and get to more I'd say fair and competitive outcomes, but it does take looking more holistically at the things that could be done. But that's all. Appreciate you taking the time to look at this.
And that's a fair point, Dan. And we do have a placeholder this year. I think it's largely going to be informed by the operational experience here that we see of EDAM. But we do have a placeholder for EDAM enhancements as well. So I'd encourage you, while there's still time, maybe suggest your low granularity topic within the policy initiatives roadmap. I think within that roadmap we also have intertie bidding, but I would encourage you to include it there, so we have a good breadth of elements that I think we can start shaping and looking at, EDAM year one enhancements, or as we try to identify if there are any issues that arise during EDAM implementation, that we can start grouping topics together. But I'd encourage you to flag it there publicly, and there's opportunity as well for you and other stakeholders then to support that emphasis on that kind of an effort, and we can find a home for it.
Yeah, will do. And last thing I'll note is just that I also recognize on some of these, there's, the CAISO is only controlling so much of it. There's also the role of the EDAM entity, BAs and TSPs, and so there is kind of this need to, I don't know, triangulate or something to come at policies that really move things forward. Takes everybody participating in that solution set.
No, that's right, and that's a great point, Dan. And again, just want to express our appreciation for you stepping up and sharing your perspectives, your concepts that you've introduced. I think this first month or two will be important, especially as you and others also receive the settlements from the EDAM entity and see the congestion revenue allocation through their tiers structure as well. That may help inform, and that experience may also help inform some aspects that we consider here. But we'll certainly, as we go through these working groups, feel free to bring some of these concepts up, any learnings that you see that could help inform consideration of additional alternatives. So really appreciate your thoughts and willingness to present and share your perspectives.
And I'm not seeing any other raised hands at this moment.
Okay, well, let's go then to the next section. So we'll now talk a little bit about some of the concepts as well introduced by the ISO. And the first topic that we'll talk about is the design concept of allocation of congestion revenues based on cleared balanced schedules. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a schedule-based approach where parties still have to schedule in the market, and the schedules are the ones that ultimately drive the level of congestion revenue allocation. But under this particular design, congestion revenues, including those that may arise from the parallel flow effects based on the different binding constraints across the EDAM footprint, those congestion revenues that arise are allocated to the EDAM balancing area based on cleared balance schedules that are associated with eligible firm OAT transmission rights in the EDAM balancing area. And we'll illustrate that more granularly here in a couple of slides. But similarly, to create symmetry with the ISO, the ISO balancing area would be allocated congestion revenues, including those with the parallel flow effects, or even for constraints that may be across the EDAM footprint, not just within the CAISO balancing area, but the ISO would be also allocated those congestion revenues, the parallel flow congestion revenues, or constraints in another EDAM balancing area. So it creates that symmetry element. The design concept was originally introduced last year in phase 1 of the initiative, but we didn't consider it fully there. We said we would evaluate it in this phase 2 to the extent that it has any merit for further evaluation. Under this particular design, for the OAT rights, the clear balance schedules associated with the OAT rights, whether these are based on underlying economic bids or sub-schedules, those cleared balance schedules at the source and sink locations that are associated with the registered OAT rights, those would be eligible for the parallel flow congestion revenue component allocation. So that'd be allocated not only for the internal constraint that may be binding within the balancing area, but also if there's any effects of constraints in another EDAM balancing area, that parallel flow component congestion revenue would be allocated to the EDAM balancing area where those rights, balance rights are located. And again, as I mentioned, for the ISO balancing areas, the CRRs would be eligible for congestion revenue allocation, not just for constraints within the ISO footprint, but now across the full or the larger EDAM market footprint. If we go to the next slide. So just to illustrate this concept in the context of OAT transmission rights, because I think for the CRRs it's a bit more straightforward. As we said, CRRs will be eligible for congestion revenue allocation. The parallel flow component across the wider EDAM footprint, even if there's a binding constraint in another EDAM balancing area. But with OAT rights, I wanted to illustrate what that means as parties hold those physical rights from location, source to sink. And so in this example, it's a simplistic example, but to illustrate the concept that there's a transmission rights, OAT transmission rights from the generator to the load. And those could be point-to-point transmission rights. Those could be NITS transmission rights where the generator is a designated network resource serving that load. But the generator holds 80 megawatt firm reservation to serve load located there, L. And based on its bid, the generator clears the market at its full 80 megawatts that's commensurate with the transmission right that it holds. The load, based on how it participated in the market, let's say the load clears at 100 megawatts. Now, the balance portion of the schedule that's associated with the source and sink location of those registered OAT rights would be 80 megawatts because the generator cleared at 80, the load cleared at 100, but the balance portion there is the lower of the two is the 80. So the congestion hedge, including that parallel flow component, would be provided for the 80 megawatts. There may be, I didn't put it in here, but there may be a different generator that also has rights that's serving load just from a different location. And so the load could be, the other 20 megawatts of the load could also be hedged depending upon how the other cleared balance schedules associated with rights that sink at that load. But here just trying to illustrate a generator to load relationship and what a balance schedule coming out of the market would look like. And so the congestion hedge that includes the parallel flow component would be for the 80 megawatts. If we go to the next, I'll pause after I review the concept one, just so folks have a more complete kind of view of the concept and some of the feedback as well. So what were some of the stakeholder comments on this concept number one? That is based on schedules and looks at cleared balance schedules. So generally stakeholders, I think, were divided on this concept as a design option. Commenters, I think, recognize the design as a potential bridge solution. A lot of them noted as a bridge solution potentially to concept number three, but also recognize that concept number one was not a viable long-term solution. Those that supported the concept in some form, and there were about 6 commenters or so. Again, the range and the qualifications on the comments of support, there were a number of them had qualifications on it that I try to capture here, but a number of those commenters recognize it as a potential bridge solution if you can't adequately agree or design a long-term solution in time. But they cautioned about the significant, or what they saw as a significant efficiency impact because of what we talked about last time. This option may not fully resolve or may not significantly impact the self-schedule incentive. It may create an incentive to bid at the economic bid floor so that you can clear the market and receive this type of a congestion hedge. And so a number of parties saw it as, while it may resolve the asymmetry issue between the ISO and EDAM balancing areas in terms of these parallel flow congestion revenues, they recognize that it may not significantly impact the efficiency goal of trying to reduce or eliminate the self-schedule incentive. Those that oppose the concept, and there were roughly a similar number, about 7 commenters that commented. There are a few parties that didn't mention anything on this concept, but those that oppose the concept, they saw it as some of them saw it as not a feasible design that entails a common unified market footprint if it doesn't have a simultaneous feasibility test. Others know that if you can't implement this type of a design fairly quickly, that it can detract the time and the implementation resources from focusing on a long-term design. It may just delay the ability to implement a long-term design. And if that's the case, if you can't implement that quickly, a number of them noted, then don't spend too much time on it. Other commenters noted that it bases allocation on schedules, and that again has a significant incentive and efficiency impact, because it may not impact significantly the incentive to self-schedule and may create the incentive to bid at the economic floor, which, you know, just to clear the market and avail themselves of this kind of an allocation. And then others noted that it's more generally, it's not an adequate solution, that it's not fully consistent with the design principles that we've established. We go to the next slide, and I'll pause after this slide just to get some perspectives and reactions, questions. But you know, we did have a couple of commenters that noted, well, is there any way to mitigate? Some of them asked more questions about the implementation. You know, what's the implementation complexity here? Because we noted that as a con and the timeline. And then others suggested, is there some way to mitigate that economic bidding incentive at the bid floor, or the self-scheduling incentive? So we wanted to think through here, is there some way to do that, to introduce some kind of a mitigation measure to make this more viable, that addresses the self-schedule incentive? You know, how far does it go? I don't know, but you know, one of the concerns with the design, the concept one design, is that, as I mentioned, the design may not adequately limit self-schedule incentives, and it may incent economic bidding at the bid floor, again, to improve that likelihood of clearing the market and avail themselves of that more complete congestion hedge based on clear balanced schedules. One potential way to mitigate that, as we thought about it here, and it was tough to find some meaningful way to do this, but you know, you could introduce a requirement that to receive this kind of a treatment, the economic bidding can't be lower than the default energy bid for the resource, and that may disincentivize, you know, the bidding at the economic bidding at the bid floor. May have an effect as well on the self-schedule incentive. But I think the question is, would it have a sufficiently measurable or meaningful impact on reducing self-schedule incentive? And you know, we certainly think it increases, trying to mitigate things this way through imposing another requirement that you must not bid below the DEB. I think it increases that implementation complexity further, because it's now another factor or eligibility factor that the system has to track to evaluate, you know, is the economic bid at a particular level or below or above, in order to apply ultimately a settlement of congestion revenues in a particular way. So that's one way that you could mitigate this, but I think it could create some additional issues, certainly create some complexity, additional complexity for implementation. But you know, is it a meaningful enough measure to disincent self-scheduling and economic bidding at the economic bid floor? Certainly at least one of those two, but I'm not sure how much, and certainly appreciate stakeholders' perspective, or if there are different mitigation measures to this type of a design. In terms of implementation complexity, as I noted, a number of commenters asked, can you give a little bit more insight as to, you know, what is the nature of the implementation complexity? Why can't this be implemented fairly quickly? And you know, as we noted internally, as we discussed what this may look like, you know, it requires certainly software and system changes that recognize the balance schedules now. It's not just simply you're exercising a schedule in the market associated with oat transmission rights. You're not exercising, you know, with a CRN solely, but now the market has to look at balance schedules at the source and sink locations of associated registered rights, and then communication, and as well as the CRR application would need to change, because now you would be looking at providing a hedge for constraints as well outside of the CAISO balancing area. But it's also the entailing communication with the settlement systems. And so it takes some sizable changes we anticipate on systems to be able to track what we need, and also some dedicated staff time to implement all of these concepts that I think, as we talked internally, would take away from, you know, being able to implement ultimately a longer term design that we may be looking at. But those are the trade-offs of looking at a near term, or for lack of a better term, maybe a quicker fix enhancement that it still needs changes and staff time that may take away from consideration implementation of other aspects. But ultimately, as we go through this process, depending on what the final nature is of that structure of the design, that timeline is really dependent upon the prioritization and the final structure for this type of a concept of balanced schedules that yield a particular congestion revenue allocation design. So let me pause here and just see if there are any questions, comments, reactions from stakeholders on concept number 1.
Taking a look here to see if there's any raised hands. I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this time.
Okay, we can come back to this as well as towards the end if folks have other things that come to mind on any of these concepts. Certainly we'll leave time at the end as well to come back to it if needed. So that's concept number 1. So let's now talk about concept number 2 that the ISO introduced last time, and it's a concept of a historical baseline that ultimately establishes financial entitlements to congestion revenues. If we can go to the next slide. So this is a concept. Before I describe it, I just to give context a little bit on the concept. But the idea is that we recognize that parallel flows will occur on interconnected systems across the EDAM footprint. Just the nature of the interconnected transmission grid, especially that's becoming more and more interconnected as new resources and transmission facilities come online and have different effects on the flows across the market footprint. But this design concept number 2 comes at the issue of congestion revenue allocation with the question of, should there be some limit to how much congestion revenue is compensated based on the parallel flow effects that parties may have on each other's systems. I think concept number 3 gets to it in a similar way and has different effects, but this concept, design concept number 2, tries to establish that limit to the parallel flow congestion revenues that would be paid or collected by establishing some form of a historical baseline for congestion revenue entitlements that apply to congestion revenue rights in the CAISO balancing area, and then OAT transmission rights in other EDAM balancing areas. And this concept establishes a historical baseline, at least as we introduced it originally. And I'll talk towards the end of this section about there could be different ways that you could look at establishing that historical baseline if we think that this type of a design idea is worth pursuing. But what we identified originally in the last meeting was a historical baseline based on a milestone date where we would account for those parallel flows across the interconnected systems. And the baseline entitlement, again, sought to recognize those historical uses of each other's systems. And the historical baseline then would be based on a milestone date, and financial congestion revenue entitlements, both for CRRs and OAT transmission rights, would be provided to those rights that fit within that have rights before that milestone date, and those transmission rights, CRRs and OAT rights that fit within that historical baseline timeline would receive eligibility for the more complete congestion revenue entitlement that includes the parallel flow component, because again, we recognize we've lived with these parallel flow effects up until that point. And now that the market is pricing them, it's appropriate to establish a differentiation based on the milestone date. But those rights within the milestone would receive the more complete financial eligibility for more complete financial entitlement that includes the parallel flow component. So they would be eligible for congestion revenues that result from an internal constraint within the balancing area, as well as a constraint that it may affect within the EDAM footprint, wider EDAM footprint, another EDAM balancing area. And those, again, entitlement, those historical baseline establishes that broader entitlement to congestion revenues. Rights outside of the baseline or beyond the baseline, after a particular historical milestone date, whether they're CRRs or OAT rights, after that date, they may not be eligible for that same level of financial entitlement as those rights within the baseline, because again, we recognize these are different uses outside of the baseline that maybe should not be compensated for that parallel flow component. And so those rights outside of the baseline or beyond the baseline would be eligible for congestion revenues that arise from the constraint only within the constraint of the host balancing area, and may not be eligible for any kind of parallel flow congestion revenue or parallel flow component that may result from a constraint outside of that host balancing area in the EDAM footprint. We did know that there could be some consideration here if we wanted to go that way, and does increase the complexity, but there could be some consideration here if we saw merit in it to potentially consider some form of a simultaneous feasibility test to evaluate if those rights beyond or outside of the baseline may still be feasible and eligible. It could potentially, some of them be eligible for the parallel flow component. But again, that certainly increases the complexity, and I think dilutes a bit of the distinction that we're trying to make between historical rights pre-milestone date that have eligibility for a broader congestion hedge compared to those rights that arise after that milestone date. If we go to the next slide. Just want to spend just a second on an overview of the stakeholder comments on this particular concept. Commenters were also divided on this, but largely opposed the conceptual design, at least based on how it was presented originally, based on that historical baseline approach that has a milestone date as a distinguishing factor between rights within the baseline that are more eligible for that more complete entitlement to congestion revenues, and rights after that milestone date that only receive the congestion revenue entitlement based on internal constraints within the balancing area. Those commenters that supported the design or commented more in support in some way, I think there were about 3 of those. They noted the design that could be a viable near-term approach if done appropriately, but it wasn't seen necessarily as a long-term design solution, more as a bridge to getting ultimately to concept number 3 or something akin to that. Others noted that it could potentially be some kind of a pragmatic middle ground, but there were some concerns by those that made that type of a comment that it could become obsolete or outdated fairly quickly. Those stakeholders that opposed this type of a concept of a historical baseline based on a milestone date, there was a lot more folks, I think about 10 entities that commented to that effect. But their grounds for opposing this type of a concept, one of them was that it creates a different treatment for transmission rights within the baseline and outside of the baseline, before the date and before a milestone date and after a milestone date. And that also could disadvantage some newer contracts or clean generation deliveries that may depend on rights that are acquired after that baseline date on a going forward basis. And overall, just some equity concerns of, right treatment of rights before and after the baseline.
I think your audio cut off. Yeah, Christina, I think your audio cut off. You're unmuted, but for some reason the audio cut off. Please stand by, everyone, while we fix the audio issues real quick.
Hi, everyone. Apologies for that. We had some audio issues.
Let's test
Yeah.
it maybe.
Are
Yeah,
you
we
able
can
to
hear you
hear
now.
us?
Yes.
Perfect.
Do you know by chance where we left off? Hope it's not concept one, but maybe I can redo it, reprise it.
And maybe
Maybe.
just reiterate it. Yeah.
Maybe
get
George
through
or
it.
John, do you, or Philip, do you know where we kind of lost audio? Not sure.
I started getting the message on this slide, so I
Okay.
think we're good to.
Okay, so we'll,
Yeah, I think concept 1, I think you're fine. I think you just have to reiterate concept 2.
okay, do you want to go back a couple slides then? Okay. So, hopefully folks can hear us now. I'm just gonna, sorry, looks like we lost audio at some point here. So I'll start with the design concept number 2 again, and if we lost audio earlier, if anybody's got questions on concept number 1, I think we can come back to that towards the end of the meeting. But just to introduce concept number 2 again, it's the concept introduces a historical baseline for the establishing congestion revenue entitlement for CRRs and O transmission rights. And the concept here is that the transmission grid between the ISO and EDAM balancing areas is an interconnected transmission grid where parallel flows will occur independent of ultimately the allocation method here. But the idea is that the concept number 2 tries to introduce the idea that maybe congestion revenues for the parallel flow effect should be bounded in some way, that it shouldn't be continue to be allocated based on the broad effect between the balancing areas, but there should be a limit as to how much of each other's system can be utilized and receive the parallel flow congestion revenues, such that some rights or some uses should not be eligible for those revenues, while others that have historically represented the usage, those could continue, but after a certain milestone or certain consideration, those revenues should not be paid out to the balancing area. So this concept establishes a historical baseline for congestion revenue entitlement, again, based on CRRs and OAT rights, by establishing a baseline based on a milestone date, such that CRRs and OAT transmission rights at or before that milestone date would be eligible for a more complete congestion revenue entitlement that includes not only constraints within the host balancing area, but it also includes constraints that it may have effect on in the broader EDAM footprint. And then those CRRs and OAT transmission rights after the milestone date, whether those are driven by new rights, new transmission upgrades, those rights would only be eligible for congestion revenues and congestion entitlements associated with internal constraints, but not the parallel flow component, not the constraints in another EDAM balancing area. So that's what the rights within the historical baseline would entail, that financial entitlement for CRRs and note rights that are effectively grandfathered in as of a milestone date, and then you have rights beyond that historical baseline that are after a particular milestone date, and they would only receive that congestion hedge for internal constraints within the balancing area. There could be consideration, as we mentioned last time in the April 17th workshop, there could be some consideration to the extent that stakeholders wanted to consider that, including some form of a simultaneous feasibility test to evaluate if the rights that are outside or beyond the baseline could feasibly flow, and they may be eligible for the parallel flow component as well. But again, that I think dilutes this option a little bit, and it also creates additional complexity in having to design what that looks like. But the concept here is rights before a baseline receive the more complete hedge, rights after that milestone date receive a sizable hedge entitlement, but it doesn't include the parallel flow component. So if we go to the next slide. So just to provide a little bit of an overview of the stakeholder comments that we received on this option. Stakeholders were generally divided on concept number 2, but the majority opposed this type of a conceptual design to a historical baseline approach. And I'll caveat this by noting that what stakeholders were reacting to in their comments was the structure of the design that we introduced in the last workshop, which established a historical baseline based on a milestone date. In a couple of slides, I'll talk about there could be other ways to do this, but it has trade-offs and other complexities associated with it. But nevertheless, these stakeholder perspectives are grounded in what they saw and what was presented at the original time. And I think what we'll want to understand better in this next round of comments are any other ways of establishing that historical baseline outside of a milestone date. Are any of those other ways of establishing the historical baseline preferred, or is it just overall the concept of establishing some historical negotiated baseline for parallel flow congestion revenues is seen as problematic? But those stakeholders that commented the design that was described, there were about 3 entities that did that, and their support was grounded in the design was seen as a near-term viable approach if done appropriately, but wasn't seen necessarily as a long-term design, more of a bridge to getting to a long-term design, which most stakeholders preferred as concept number 3. Others noted that it could be a pragmatic middle ground, but there's risk of it becoming outdated and obsolete fairly quickly because you're basing your establishment here of the baseline on outdated and concepts that may quickly change. Those commenters that oppose the concept number 2 of a historical baseline, there were roughly 10 commenters that in some way raised concern and opposition to it. Some noted that the design as described created a different treatment for transmission rights pre and post milestone date, those that fit within the historical baseline and those that are outside of it or beyond it. And that could also disadvantage some clean generation deliveries. The idea was that, clean resources may be delivered on transmission rights that are acquired after that baseline, and that may disadvantage those types of deliveries because they may not be able to receive a same eligibility for a similar hedge. But overall, there were some equity concerns that folks raised between creating a distinction between certain rights before and after a milestone date. Others noted the design as impractical, that the inputs may be stale, and in a changing Western grid where you have resources retiring, new resources coming on, new technologies that have different effects on the grid, new transmission facilities that may be coming on, and then more so new market participants or different market participants. It could all change the flow patterns, the parallel flow effect on each other's system, that creating some form of a historical baseline or historical distinction based on usage or right was impractical because of the changing uses and nature of the grid in the West. And then others noted a high implementation complexity for this type of a design of establishing a historical baseline, that it could really detract from focus and development and implementation of a long-term design. Go to the next slide. Okay, so I want to just briefly touch on some additional conceptual or some additional design details that I think folks can react to and consider in their next set of comments. Do these make this type of a design more viable? And the next slide is going to try to illustrate the concepts so folks can react to. And then the last slide on this section is going to look to identify, are there different factors or different things that the historical baseline could be based upon that makes this more viable outside of just a milestone date that differentiates between rights. But based on the concept that we introduced of a historical baseline based on a milestone date, I think a viable date here would be the date of the execution of the EDAM implementation agreement. It's not the implementation itself, but it's when parties execute the EDAM implementation agreement, that is a viable date, because now it puts parties on notice that rights before that effectively could receive that broader hedge versus rights after that milestone date. But that could be the date that establishes that distinction. And then point-to-point rights and CRRs, they're fairly similar in terms of the source-to-sink static nature of those. Those, I think, are a little bit easier to conceptualize and model within this design, because you have a static source, a static sink, and a megawatt amount. But I think where the uniqueness comes in applying this type of a design is, how do you model NITS transmission rights in particular? And here's the concept of how this could be done that folks can react to. And if we want to pursue this type of an approach, we can further find refinements to this. But one way of modeling the NITS transmission rights, which are under the load serving entity rights, and NITS transmission is used to serve the load, is that NITS transmission rights within this kind of a historical baseline would be based on the annual peak load for the year that the milestone is established. So if the milestone is established in May of 2025, you would look at, well, what is the annual peak load for that particular year? And then based on those rights, the EDAM entity, working with its transmission customers, transmission providers, if there are multiple within the balancing area, would identify the source and sink combinations associated with the firm NITS transmission rights, the designated network resources that may exist. And they would identify what are the different source and sink combinations up to the peak load that could be modeled within this historical baseline to establish the financial congestion revenue entitlements. But you leave it to the EDAM entity to work with its customers based on how it sees and plans to use its designated resources to serve those loads. So some of the challenges I think that we would need to keep in mind when looking at this historical baseline approach, as well as, are there unique considerations that need to be given to, particularly, how do you apply a historical baseline to balancing areas that are already within the market? The CAISO, Pacificor, others that may be within the market at the time. How do you apply this type of a historical baseline to them compared to future entities that may be coming in? into the EDAM. There may be, I think, some nuances that we'll need to consider. Does it make sense to apply a milestone date for those that are already within the market, if they may have been in the market for a couple of years, for example, versus those that are just coming in? But that's something to consider. And then also, when considering a historical baseline based on the milestone data, how do you treat transmission rights that may not yet be effective, may not be usable, but they are executed contracts for transmission upgrades that may be on the way at the time that the historical baseline date is set. So if the baseline is May of 2025, but you have pending transmission upgrades that have not yet been energized, you've sold transmission rights, is there any kind of a unique treatment to those, or do those fit within that baseline, even though they're not yet usable until a date after the baseline? If we go to the next slide, and then I think after the next one we can pause for Steve questions. Just to illustrate concept again, this is a more basic illustration. It's certainly more complex the more rights you add to this, and to be able to track them, those rights within the baseline and outside of the baseline. But in the upper part is a couple of transmission right, or one transmission right, firm 01, that's for 75 megawatts from a generator G1 to a load L1, and then you have CRRs as well, that's for 35 megawatts between G3 and L3 as an example, source and sink pairs. Within that historical baseline, those firm out rights, firm out 1 and CRR3, those be eligible for the more complete congestion revenue entitlement that is based on internal constraints to the balancing area, as well as constraints that may exist across the broader EDAM footprint. But that entitlement is based upon from that source to sink location and the effects on the constraints across the broader footprint. And then to contrast that with rights outside of that historical baseline, you have firm O2 right and a CRR4. You see the megawatts there, but they're from different sources and things. But those two types of rights that are outside of the baseline, those will be eligible only for congestion revenues associated with constraints that are internal to their balancing area. So for the CRR4, the eligibility is for the congestion revenues within the CAISO balancing area only, from that source to sink location. And then firm O2 is eligible only for congestion revenue entitlements associated with a constraint within the EDAM balancing area where that firm O right 2 is located. Again, simplistic illustration. It gets more complex the more rights you add to it. The modeling of niche rights, the different point-to-point rights, the CRRs. But if you can establish that historical baseline, this is how that distinction would work. Now let's go to the next slide, and then I think we can pause for questions, reactions, and any feedback. We did want to note that this type of a design of a historical baseline doesn't have to be based upon a milestone date. I think the reason that we identified a historical milestone date for consideration is because it provided an objective way of establishing that baseline that is scalable as additional EDAM entities join the market. It's a preset, it's described milestone such that it's got applicability to any future entity that joins 27, 28, or whenever that is. They know what the rules are, and the rules apply in the same way across each entrant. But there could be different ways if we wanted to mitigate some of those concerns that stakeholders raised about distinction between outright or CRRs, pre-baseline milestone date and post-baseline milestone. There could be different ways of establishing that historical baseline. One of those could be based on historical flows, historical uses of the systems. And so there will be some evaluation of the historical flow patterns between the balancing areas and the parallel flow contributions. and those historical flows based on the particular constraints that may be affected, those could establish a limit to the allocation of parallel flow congestion revenues. There could be a negotiated aspect to this between the two balancing areas that would use historical flows as the determining factor. But again, this is a little bit different in that this is now more of a one-to-one negotiated balancing area by balancing area basis to evaluate those historical flows and create that basis for an entitlement that will be negotiated between the two balancing areas. There could also be a historical baseline that's based on some kind of a pre-established dollar limit for parallel flow congestion revenue allocations. Again, this is a negotiated limit based on some historical effect metric that would need to be established to create that dollar limit for parallel flow congestion revenues that could flow between the two balancing areas. But you establish, if you establish, for example, a $500,000 limit between two EDAM balancing areas, you're only going to pay out the parallel flow effects of congestion revenue up to that amount and nothing above that across a particular time frame, and that creates kind of that bound to the exposure to the parallel flow congestion revenue allocation and the cost shift that may occur as the systems evolve. This does require a negotiation on an individual basis, again, between balancing areas. It may not be a same limit for every balancing area. And so it is a bit more of a manual approach to establishing those limits and ultimately translating that to a dollar limit that would have to be established. And the settlement, again, under both of these would occur with the EDAM entity up to that amount that you establish, and then the EDAM entity will have to determine how it suballocates that parallel flow congestion revenue that we may have received up to that limit. It would have to dictate under its own tariff how to divvy that up between its transmission customers, which I think, again, this one doesn't create an objective of a set of criteria that could be applied across every entering entity. It's a negotiated approach with each incoming entity and between entities that may become fairly burdensome and difficult to administer, but these are concepts that we wanted to get some reactions to as well, to the extent that folks' opposition to the historical baseline approach was mainly driven by the distinction of milestone dates and pre and post treatment of rights in those milestones. There's different ways of doing this. I think all of them have their trade-offs and challenges, but I think these two are a bit more subjective and create a need for bilateral negotiation to a larger extent than the historical baseline with a pre-established milestone date in the tariff. Let's pause here then for some reactions, questions from stakeholders.
Yeah, so we have a hand raised from Steve Keen. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, Steve Keen from Edison. I want to go talk about how, like, the NITS transmission and how that's going to be done, because I see that as a fairly large problem in the sense that I think things may change in the way that's done. I mean, like, currently in most of these BAAs, NITS transmission service would be designed to, for entities to move power from their generator to their load. As the market opens up, they may want to change how they do that. But it's like, what limits? I mean, I can't see how it would work without the EDAM entity putting some kind of simultaneous feasibility test to make sure that whatever people are requesting from their NIT service to this, to make sure that that's even doable within their balancing authority area before you actually get to the bigger one. It just seems to me to be problematic.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. Yeah, I think transmission providers under the OAT construct with the NIT service which is effectively native load or service for transmission service for load serving entities. They have their own evaluations through their ATC methodologies. Anytime somebody looks to a generator or the load serving entity itself seeks NITS transmission to deliver a generator, they effectively have to designate the resource. And so that goes through the evaluation of the transmission provider for ATC from the source of that generator to the load. And you can have more designated network resources than load, but under the oath, your usage is really use of the NITS transmission is limited by the load. So you could have, two times more resources designated than load, but at any given time, you're using, you can't use more NITS than the load. So the thought here was, and there could be different ways again of doing this. If we decide that we want to pursue this kind of a concept or a historical baseline, we would have to figure out how to model those NITS rights as of that historical baseline date. There may be different ways of doing it, but one way of doing it is again looking at the peak load that the NITS customers within the EDAM balancing area have, and while they may have more resources than load, the EDAM entity would have to work with their transmission providers and customers to identify the appropriate source and sink pairs of already designated resources that they want to match up to that load amount.
I guess part of what I'm seeing is, I think this, to me, that seems to be the very similar situation that exists in the CAISO when you're talking about allocating CRRs, right? Entities have to put in their requests. We realize that everybody, lots of entities want to get the same CRRs. So we have to go through this process where we determine how much is available, the single feasibility test to do that. And I think you may see the same thing arising in the various, other entities where essentially, they have a right, they have NIT service, which gives them a right to transmission up to their load, but it can't necessarily all happen at the same time, especially once a market comes in and possibly changes where people want that, those allocations to flow. And, that's kind of one thing I think I guess this is one thing that I'm coming to see as a big problem with setting this historical limit or something is it's based on a very different system. So entities may decide that, yes, I had NITS, but, now that I see how the market's functioning, I don't necessarily want it in the same ways that I was doing it historically. I now want it to come from, interties with the CAISO where, I can get cheap power during the solar hours or something like that. And I think that's something that we're going to need to have to address.
Okay, yeah, and we can see maybe how this works in concept number three, but keep in mind that independent of the market and how the market ultimately is solving on a day-to-day basis to find the most efficient way of serving the load, I still envision these parties are going to continue to designate network resources on a long-term basis for resource efficiency. So while the market may dispatch the import, because it's the most efficient solution, the entities will still have, a pool of designated network resources that they'll be offering into the market, and so the market will solve. But here the question is for their designated resources that may or may not get dispatched by the market, depending on how they're offered into it. How do you represent those how do you represent those physical rights that the oath gives them, which is I think a little bit different from the CRRs, but how do you represent those within the baseline? And I think the challenge from my perspective with this is that anytime you try to represent those rights, just like with the CRRs within a historical baseline, yes, it could be if you don't have any kind of reopening provisions at with some frequency, it could become stale, which is along the lines of what stakeholders noted, that the inputs here may be stale and with the changing uses of the grid and different patterns that parties may contract for transmission rights and meet their contractual obligations. So I see some of your points here as well, and I think that's generally the challenge that stakeholders raise with this type of approach. Basing anything on a historical baseline for these congestion raises these challenges of outdated information. Is it reflective, or is there a better way of reflecting the dynamic nature of the grid? That's where people gravitated more towards concept number 3, but we wanted to test at least out, is there some viable way of using a historical baseline? Because that's where a number of entities, at least, you know, the MSC and governing body expert noted that this could be a concept of a negotiated historical determinant as at least as a starting point. But I recognize some of the concerns, which are consistent, I think, with what others noted as well, of outdated inputs into a historical approach.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time.
Okay, if folks are willing to power through, let's go to concept number 3. And after a few slides, you won't have to hear my voice. We'll switch it to Philip, but I'll introduce this concept and then talk a little bit about the design, the comments, and then what we wanted to do with concept number 3, since that's where most stakeholders that commented gravitated on. We wanted to describe a little bit better or a little bit more granularly how this concept could work by leveraging the existing simultaneous feasibility test processes that the ISO employs within its CRR process, and where OAT rights could fit into this in order to establish those financial entitlements. So this will be a little bit of an overview with comments, and then we'll delve deeper into a bit of an educational session of how the SFT works today in order to ground the broader stakeholder community into the purpose and function of the SFT, simultaneous feasibility test. And then that will allow us, stakeholders and others, to better react to, where could OAT rights be incorporated, or how could the SFT be incorporated with CRRs and OAT rights to produce those financial entitlements. Those will be partly an educational session, and then we'll talk through how these pieces could fit together. So the third concept is this congestion revenue entitlement that result from a simultaneous feasibility test process. We go to the next slide. So the description here is that OAT rights and congestion revenue rights, without establishing a historical period or baseline, but on an ongoing basis, those rights that may exist and will exist in the future, all would be evaluated through a common simultaneous feasibility test process that will determine the congestion revenue entitlement associated with those rights. The common simultaneous feasibility test process would be conducted on an annual basis as well as a monthly basis, and it will be modeled, at least as a starting point that we wanted to test, modeled after the current SFT process that's in the CRI allocation, and Philip is going to cover that shortly on what that entails and how that works and what the SFT produces. But in the annual simultaneous feasibility test process, it would establish annual congestion revenue entitlements for both CRRs and OAT rights. And then in the monthly simultaneous feasibility test process, it would establish monthly congestion revenue entitlements above those that may have been awarded in the annual process or granted in the annual process, to the extent that they were not granted up to its full capability. But it allows you to kind of mesh and frequently and more dynamically and frequently run these simultaneous feasibility tests that hopefully more accurately reflect the effect on the systems and the resulting entitlements, especially as parties continue to allocate and create new CRRs with new projects that may come on, but also new transmission rights that may come on that allow for awards of OAT transmission rights. So the simultaneous feasibility test then would evaluate that feasibility of flow across not just the CAISO balancing area, but now across the broader EDAM footprint based on the transmission rights, the CRRs, and the OAT rights that may have been nominated to consider into that SFT process. And then that output, both on the annual and the monthly time frame, would identify those discrete congestion revenue entitlements. In terms of settlement considerations here, do want to note here that the allocation of congestion revenues could continue here with the EDAM entity, or it could open the door potentially for these discrete rights for allocation with the directly with the OAT rights holder. But both of these options are feasible here of continuing to do it through the EDAM entity, who would then sub-allocate under its own, or more directly with the entities associated with the nominated rights. I think under any of these circumstances, the congestion revenues that may accrue above and beyond those that are associated with the nominated rights, because it's not every right, as we talked about before, it's those eligible OAT rights, so it may not be non-firm, etc. So there may be some instances congestion revenues that remain after you've satisfied all of those other entitlements, and those congestion revenues would flow to the EDAM entity to sub-allocate under the terms of its tariff. If we go to the next slide. So just do want to do a brief overview of the stakeholder comments on this concept. And I will note here that I think the intent is to delve deeper into the details, because I think the details is where this design matters the most, and that's what we intend to start doing today, just to look and see how could the different components work together, and bring other people up to speed that are not familiar with the SFT. But the devil will be in the details with this approach. All that to couch, I think, the support here, because I think it's support of the concept, but now we have the toughest task of delving into the details to make this work more workable. But there was broad support across the commenters for the continued evaluation of this concept as the long-term design. I think practically everybody that commented supported this concept as the most viable concept on a long-term basis, and where you want it to be on a long-term basis. The common simultaneous feasibility that the test was seen as having the potential to equitably integrate both OAT rights that have a similar nature as CRRs, meaning that they are defined from source to sink, and that allow themselves then to be integrated into this SFT process. But it gives the best potential to equitably integrate those into a common allocation that determines the entitlements, a common process that establishes common entitlements. Commenters also noted that this concept avoids some of the concerns with the historical baseline, since it provides uniform treatment irrespective of when the rights were acquired. It provides for uniform treatment of OAT rights and CRRs across the market footprint. And then others noted as well that concept number 3 most closely aligns with the established design principles, in that particularly aside from having the ability to more equitably create that allocation of the financial entitlements and provide a level of transparency into it by running the SFT, you can identify what the constraints are, where and who's impacted, what rights are affected, but also it more effectively addressed the self-scheduling incentives concern, because this removes that incentive. It's not based on scheduling, it's based on the SFT and the entitlement that parties have. And then it also addressed the asymmetry concerns that it created a common application of this by integrating OAT rights and CRRs into common SFT. It created equitable assessment across both types of products. We go to the next slide. Okay, let me pause here before we for any questions. I see Jordan has a question, and this is a nice break for a bit of an education on the SFT process today and where OAT rights could fit. And then I'll come back and talk a bit about more detail on how we could model some of these rights. But I think this is a good breaking point for any kind of questions before we jump into a more granular discussion of how this could work. I see Jordan has a question.
You might be double muted right now if you're speaking, Jordan.
Can we check out where, can we be heard? I think we can. We're lining up great. Okay, Jordan, we can't hear you, but if maybe you know, we can come back to your question at some point here as we continue through concept number 3. Raise your hand when you think you've maybe resolved the audio issue, and we can test you again.
And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. We're still on concept number 3. We'll be here for a little bit on this type of a structure. So feel free to ask questions, and I'll defer to Philip when he wants to pause for questions along the way. But next, what we'll talk about is the simultaneous feasibility process and some of the design consideration. We'll talk about this in the context of how the SFT process works today, its function, how it's conducted, what it produces, and then how it fits within the CRR process. That I think is going to give us a good way to think about where in the process oat rights could fit in. And I think that's where the details are going to be important around this particular design that we can delve into further in future workshops. So we wanted to provide at least an ability for folks to think about this kind of a design and provide some reactions and feedback along the way. And I think Jordan had some questions about, well, what's better or worse in terms of direct settlement versus VA settlement. Let's put that before we close out concept number 3. We'll come to that type of a discussion on the distinctions and what parties may consider between VA settlement versus individual, more direct settlement. But I'll turn it over to Philip Roth now, who is our lead market design engineer, and he works on congestion revenue rights in the ISO. Is very familiar with the simultaneous feasibility test process as one of our experts within the ISO on that, and he's taking over for Jim McLean, who was our resident expert and is retired on CRRs, and he's our new Jim, for lack of a better term, but our resident expert on CRRs. So Philip, I'll turn it over to you if you can hear us, and just let Christina know when you want to move from slide to slide.
Hey, thank you, Melissa. And yeah, definitely some big shoes to fill there from Jim, but I'll do my best. So yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, as Miller said, I'm Philip Roth. I'm a lead engineer here in CAISO on the team that carries out our CRR market. So I'll go over the SFT as it exists today, how it's utilized in the CRR process, and some potential places where oat rights could fit into that. Next slide, please. All right, so just conceptually at a high level, the simultaneous feasibility test is a technical power flow analysis used in power systems engineering to verify that a set of modeled physical or market transactions can be implemented together without violating system constraints. It's an integral part of the CRR process, and I'll get more into the details on a later slide, but we do execute the SFT for each of the CRR allocation market tiers, which we run on both a seasonal and, an annual and a monthly basis. And the main purpose for applying the SFT is to ensure that CRRs created through an allocation or auction process are economically feasible. Next slide, please. All right, so here's just a bit of a visual diagram as far as the inputs, outputs, and what's going on within the optimization of the simultaneous feasibility test. As far as the inputs, for CRR purposes, we have all of the nominations, or in the case of an auction, the bids. I'll really focus more on the allocation aspect of the simultaneous feasibility test, as that's more applicable to this conversation. But just know there is a separate optimization and slightly different inputs and outputs that are applicable to the auction as compared to the allocation. But anyway, for the CRR allocation and the simultaneous feasibility test, we have the nominations, which come in as the inputs. I think it was mentioned previously, but for the SFT, we do have to have a source to sink pair for those nominations. So a particular path with a source and sink designated along with the megawatt quantity being requested. And then the other components of that nomination are really just the effective period and time of use for which that nomination corresponds to. The network model is the other big input here. So we take the full network model and we convert that into a format that's usable for our SFT execution. We take all the network topology, we apply outages based on certain business rules. We model all of the enforced constraint limits, the contingency cases, which represent all of those n-1 scenarios that are enforced in the IFM. And we define all of the different source and sink points as far as what are the underlying nodes that form aggregate nodes and what are their participation factors in those aggregate nodes, all of those kind of details. Okay, the other input that comes into the SFT are the pre-existing positions, or we could call those base loading flows. So those would be CRRs that already exist for the given period and time of use that's being executed, as well as ETC or TOR rights that we model to sort of carve out that capacity and make sure that it's not allocated again for CRR purposes. Okay, so those are the main inputs. As far as what is actually happening with the optimization, for the allocation process, we utilize a weighted least squares methodology. The mathematical equation is listed here, but essentially the optimization is trying to minimize the amount of curtailment or how many requested megawatts are not able to be awarded in a way that has been decided to be equitable. So it uses this weighted least squares methodology. As far as the outputs of the process, the main one, of course, are the awards. So for all of the nominations that were requested, which ones of those and what megawatt quantity can be awarded without violating the constraints that are modeled in the system. And then the second output there I've listed as more of a reporting or explanation of the results, but really that's like the binding constraints, which were the limiting factors that determine what could clear, and really only applicable for the auction SFT would be things like the source and sink clearing prices, which would sort of explain the outcomes and how they were arrived at. Okay, if we could move to the next slide, please. All right, so just providing a little bit more detail into some of the modeling considerations that come into play for the simultaneous feasibility test. If you think about it from one perspective, the SFT takes a set of CRR source to sink nominations and applies these to the full network model as if they were generators and loads. We could think, injections and withdrawals. And when we set up the SFT, we use the full network model topology, the source and sinks, which I mentioned previously, all the different aggregate nodes, the trading hubs, and all of the underlying nodes which make up their definitions, all the constraint limits, all the contract rights that we withhold capacity for. So we need to identify their equivalent paths and megawatt quantities so that we can include those into our SFT execution. Looking to how this is applicable or some potential ways that the outrights fit into this. As far as the F&M topology, this is where the entire EDAM footprint can be modeled as part of this SFT execution. So we do model the full network model as it exists today for CRR purpose, but there may be some changes to that or ways we can incorporate the full EDAM footprint and model certain constraints or not, depending on how we end up incorporating everything. And then this is also where, when we're setting up the SFT, the eligible OAT transmission rights could also be considered into the SFT as another input along with the CRR nomination paths. And then just one more point on this slide here is that the constraints which we enforce in the CRR process should be as consistent as possible with those used in the IFM. But due to the timing differences and the use of a DC model in CRR, there are some inherent differences. So really just want to, again, kind of bring everyone to the same understanding and understand some of the details of the SFT based on the fact that for CRR purpose, we are setting up either a seasonal or a monthly model. We have a fixed topology that's used for that sort of granularity, whereas in day-ahead market, there could be different outages that are applied on an hourly basis that, due to those inherent differences, there may be some differences in our model compared to what occurs in day-ahead every day. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so next I will be talking a little bit about the timing and granularity of the SFT executions as they are currently carried out in the CRR market. So for the annual process, we start approximately 4 to 5 months before each calendar year, creating the models and setting up the assumptions that are used for the CRR process. The outcome of the annual CRR process are seasonal CRRs for the upcoming year. So each CRR in the annual process corresponds to a particular season, which are listed here on the slide. We just break the 12 months into the 3-month chunks, so seasons 1 through 4, and each CRR is applicable for a given time of use, which currently is either the peak time of use or off-peak time of use. In the annual process for the SFT, we do include only 65% of the transmission system capacity that's in service for the start of the annual CRR allocation and auction processes. And next slide, please. All right, so in the annual CRR allocation process, the SFT execution and the resulting CRR allocation markets are set up in a tiered system. You could also kind of think of these as, in a way, a priority system. So in the various tiers we have are tier 1, which is also referred to as the priority nomination process. In this tier, load serving entities are eligible to essentially renominate paths they've already been awarded from the previous year. So the source and sink combinations would be based on what was previously feasible, and entities can nominate totally up to 50% of their load metric. Something to keep in mind when we're talking about how much could be nominated in the context of the SFT, you can think of that as there are essentially 2 places where there's a limitation on what could be awarded. The first is how much can be nominated, and then the second is what's actually feasible based on the power flow and what's being optimized in the SFT execution. So when I talk about up to 50% of the load metric, that's really applying to a restriction on how much could be nominated. And then whatever is nominated is then still run through the SFT to determine what could clear based on system capacity. So that is the tier 1 tier. And then following that in the CR process is the tier long term. And in this allocation tier, the awards coming out of tier 1 can be elected to be extended out an additional 9 years. So it's a way for load serving entities who do receive CRRs in Tier 1 to extend those out and have a CRR position that's effective for a total of 10 years if desired. In Tier 2, entities can nominate up to 2/3 of their seasonal CRR eligible quantity. The SEQ, which is that seasonal eligible quantity, there's some formula as to how that's calculated, but the main driving point of that is the amount of load that an entity has that would be eligible. So in Tier 2, entities are limited to 2/3 of their SEQ for each season, time of use, and sink. And then whatever awards they already have, so coming out of Tier 1 or previous long-term market, would also be subtracted from their eligibility as those entities already have that volume of CRRs. And finally, in the annual CRR process, Tier 3, in which entities can nominate fully up to 100% of their seasonal eligible quantity for each applicable season, time of use, and sink location. And again, just subtracting out any CRRs they've already obtained that would be valid for that same season, time of use, and sink. So expanding this to how outrights could fit into this process. Again, this could be an opportunity for just an additional input into each of these tiers. And if we applied a similar type of restriction to how much could be nominated, there are things like the 50% of load metric in Tier 1, 2/3 of the eligibility in Tier 2, and then the full eligibility could be nominated in Tier 3. Just a potential thought there for these for stakeholders to take into consideration as we're continuing through this process here. So just a note there, the SFT of the allocation tiers are executed sequentially. So just for make sure there's not any confusion over this point, there's not just one SFT execution for our annual process. There are sequential SFT executions for each allocation tier. So whatever clears in a earlier tier becomes fixed and base loaded into subsequent tiers and would not be able to be reduced in subsequent tiers. Okay, if we go to the next slide, please. All right, so that was the annual process I just went through on the previous slide. Now I'll talk a little bit about the monthly CRR allocation process. So we do also administer a monthly SFT execution for the each calendar month. We start our process about 6 weeks prior to the start of each month. That's where we start creating and posting the models that will be used for that process. And then the allocation markets and the nomination windows and SFT execution occur usually about 2 to 3 weeks prior to the start of the month. So that's when each month we evaluate which positions could be awarded for each month. In our monthly process, there are 2 allocation tiers. So in Tier 1, entities can nominate 100% of their monthly eligible quantity, or up to 100%, minus any CRRs that they already hold for that month that would come out of either the annual process or the annual allocation process or long-term allocation process. And then there's a second tier, the Tier 2, which again, entities can fully nominate up to 100% of their eligible quantity minus any annual allocated CRRs or CRRs they were awarded in Tier 1. So expanding this to outright, this would potentially be an opportunity for positions to be nominated up to the full eligible amount, minus whatever was already feasible and awarded out of the annual process. And then just a note here as well, there are some adjustments that are currently made to the constraint limits used in our monthly SFT process. So we do have a global derate factor, which we reduce the total amount of transmission capacity that's available to account for things like unplanned transmission outages or outages that are not known at the time of the CRR model being set up, as well as maybe other differences between the CRR model and day-ahead model. So I mentioned previously things like the CRR model using DC power flow versus AC, and there's some other nuances there. So that results in the use of this global derate factor to account for some of those unknowns or differences. And there's also a local derate factor applied to a handful of interface constraints to account for unplanned outages, and this is adjusted on a interface by interface basis. Great, and next slide, please. All right, I think this is where I'll turn it back over to you, Milos. Yep.
Yeah, and maybe we can pause before moving to this one, because this slide is going to go into just how you could model point-to-point and NIST rights within the different annual and monthly SFT processes. But I think we have a couple of questions from CD, and then I think Jordan that maybe we can address within this presentation before I move to that. So maybe we'll start with CD and then go to Jordan after that. Go ahead, CD, if you're able to. I think he's locked.
Yeah, can we please unmute CD McLean?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Good afternoon, Christopher McLean, staff, California Energy Commission. Thanks, Philip, for the presentation. I had a question on page 31. Maybe if we could page back. Okay,
On the
so
slide?
yeah. So for situations where there are these constraints, like the 65% capacity constraint, or other sort of local or global constraints, is it on the work plan of the ISO to sort of assess whether or not those things might be sort of turned into variables and included in the optimization, so you sort of end up with like a solution surface for different levels of constraint on transmission system capacity or local variables. Any thoughts on sort of like handling this optimization problem with more cutting edge techniques is kind of roughly the question.
Well, I can maybe give my initial thoughts there, and then if anyone in the office there wants to jump in and add on, feel free. But we do have functionality within our system already to change some of those parameters. So things like the 65% capacity being made available, we have the ability to change something like that from a implementation standpoint, but I think it's really more of a policy decision around whether or not we should change that value and to what it should be changed. So I'll just mention there is another initiative that's underway right now related to the CRR market, the CRR enhancements initiative, where some of those questions are being raised and discussed. But when you say like cutting edge technology, things like that, it's not necessarily we couldn't do a different number. It's really more should a different number be used. That's my take on it.
Thank you. Those are good observations. I would just say that we're still saying a number, like we're tweaking a number. I'm talking like generalizing it and turning it into a surface, and you're finding the optimal solution across that as a variable. It definitely blows up the size of the problem, And then the question sort of, falls back to, okay, what are you using as a software stack to, attack these sort of optimization problems? And I don't know if you have a moment to sort of speak towards the software that that you're deploying. Hopefully it's something like Garobi that's kind of leading edge, especially in applied space for these sorts of problems.
Yeah, I don't know. I could really speak to that myself. It's a little bit beyond my expertise there, so that might be one we have to take as maybe a follow-up question. But yeah, I don't know. I could really speak to that today.
Yeah, CD, if this is Milos, if you want to maybe put your question in writing, we can circle back with some of the other folks on the CRR team and think about that as well. But yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'll take Philip's suggestion to maybe take a look at the other initiatives. So thanks, Milos.
Yeah, and thank you, CD. We can go to Jordan's question, and I think maybe you can read it. I don't know if Jordan's question in the chat was, what is the pros and cons, or what's the distinction between, from a settlement perspective, settlement with the EDAM entity, or what are the trade-offs, settlement with the EDAM entity versus direct settlement? And I'll turn it over to James just to give a bit of context for that.
So from a context perspective, for the settlement is to us that whatever the appropriate party that is being considered responsible for that product, i.e. congestion, or even if it's energy, that's who we'll settle with. I think you're trying to get more into the area of what is the rationale for settling with the entity versus the individual SCs, and in essence, how do we also mitigate a change to have it more of a direct settlement? That would require a significant stakeholder meeting where we would revisit all of the charge codes where we are doing an indirect settlement with the entity, and so that the entity can do a sub-allocation per their oath. We would have to come up with a common methodology across all BAAs, and that it would be the methodology that would do the direct settlement, and then it would require it being incorporated in our tariff as the market operator, not as a BAA function for us. So it's for transmission customers. Yes, a direct settlement is probably more conducive because you get it all in a single statement versus two statements. But through going through the indirect settlement or through going to the entity, there is benefits that may come about with the entity having a different methodology that you may feel is more causation perspective than what we currently have in the ISO tariff. So there's benefits and advantages in either direction, but particularly when it comes to OAT allocation, right now that OAT distribution is strictly a BAA function and not a market operator function. So that would definitely make a significant change in stakeholder process to make that market operator function instead of a BAA function.
And Jordan, that's a broad answer to overall why the settlements are, with the BA in large part versus directly with customers. I think within this context, we'd need to evaluate more specifically, just granularly on the congestion revenue side. We'll need to, through this particular initiative, if we go down the route of concept number 3, we'll need to evaluate what would it take and the pros and cons of, or optionality in terms of settlement with the EDAM entity or direct for congestion revenues only.
And Jordan wrote in that was helpful. Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Let's go back to just number 32. just to contextualize for folks to make sure that they can. What we're trying to note here is of how could OAT rights, eligible OAT transmission rights, point-to-point and NITs fit within the allocation. So within the annual process, as Philip said, is OAT rights, whether point-to-point or NIT, in the annual process, 50% of that would go into tier 1, then up to 2/3 of those rights would go, of the megawatt quantity would go into tier 2, and then the remaining amount would go into tier 3, and that would lead to an annual allocation based on the results of the SFT into the annual, that would be an annual allocation of congestion revenue entitlements. And then if you go on slide 33, then in the monthly process, you would incorporate whatever you didn't get in terms of entitlements in the annual process, the remainder you would incorporate into the monthly process, where you would run the SFT again with additional inputs on the topology of the system, and you would then the remainder you could allocate here on a monthly basis to OAT rights, remaining entitlements up to their full megawatt capacity in the monthly process to the extent that they're deemed feasible. So that's how incorporation of OAT rights, at least as a starting point, could work here. Is in the annual process, you follow the tiers, and then the remainder of those rights that may not have been allocated or may not have been feasible in the annual process, the remainder, out of 100 megawatt reservation, 90 may have been feasible in the annual process through those tiers. The remaining 10 megawatts would go, for example, into the monthly CRR process, and seeing whether that can also, in the monthly process, receive a financial entitlement. But if we go to slide 34, that's my slide, just to move the discussion forward on potentially, modeling of OAT transmission rights within the simultaneous feasibility process. The eligible OAT rights, at least as a starting point, that we could envision is that these are firm rights, long-term and monthly firm point-to-point and NITs transmission rights. The point-to-point rights, I think, a little bit easier to model because they're from a defined source to a defined sink for a reserved megawatt amount, and those could fit from source to sink into the annual and the monthly SFT process. NITs rights may require unique consideration, and this is where I think if we went down this path, we could receive stakeholder input and ideas. But as a starting point, just to get us thinking about this, in the annual simultaneous feasibility process, you could look at the load, NITs load, based on its peak load forecast for the year, and that the EDAM entity nominates the designated resources from source to sink up to that annual peak load amount that could be modeled in the SFT, and that results in a level of entitlements. In the monthly SFT, you could look then at the monthly peak load forecast and then take further or refine nominations based on those designated resources and what may not have been already being simultaneously feasible in the annual process. You could refine it then within the monthly process and incorporate additional potentially rights to the extent that things have changed between, on a month-to-month basis, both on a point-to-point and a NITs transmission rights side. Additional rights or different rights may have been granted that could be incorporated here. So let's pause more just on concept number 3, because here we've talked through now concept number 3, and hopefully there's enough for stakeholders to react to in the set of comments, and as we think about the details on how to make number 3 more viable. But let's pause here just to see if there are any more questions on concept number 3 before we move on, just to talk a little bit about managing underfunding risk, similar to what we did last time.
Giving it a moment for stakeholders to raise hands. I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this time.
Okay, well, let's just go to next slide and then next steps after this. But just there was a theme across stakeholder comments again on how do you manage underfunding risk associated with some of these concepts that we've introduced. And I think by and large, a number of stakeholders that chose to comment on this front agreed that underfunding risk should be managed on a pro rata basis, similar to what we do today in the ISO with the CRR 1B, what we call a design. But in effect, these entitlements that may arise, particularly from concepts number 2 and 3, could be affected closer in time based on unplanned constraints or transmission outages that may materialize outside of the window that you've evaluated the entitlement. And so the market operator may not collect sufficient congestion revenues to be able to fully pay out all of the entitlements that parties may hold under those designs. And in some instances, may not be the case frequently or often, but in some instances that may be the case depending on what's going on closer in time. But in those instances, the market operator will only allocate the congestion revenues that it's collected. Only those collected revenues will be allocated, and an entitlement to those congestion revenues doesn't establish a financial right to congestion revenues that may not have been collected. So whatever is collected would be allocated through that entitlement process among the entitlement holders. Let me see if you want to add anything to that, James, about the management of that underfunding risk.
No, nothing really to add.
Okay. Let's see if we have any comments or questions on that front.
We did just get another question from Jordan Miner, asking if changes to the global D rate factor are decided upon, would that decision occur in CRRE or in CRA?
The global D rate factor. I think that to the extent that we choose to proceed with concept number 3, that depends on a common simultaneous feasibility test. I think, we'll work together to identify, that connection, and we'll probably talk about it in both initiatives to create awareness. But I think across both initiatives, we'll take feedback and then make a decision based on that.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Alva Svoboda. Go ahead, Alva.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Alva from PG&E. I'm just trying to get a basic understanding here so the basic idea is that these congestion entitlements are like CRRs. They're calculated at the same time that the CRRs are, and then they're used to affect the allocation of congestion revenues to the BAA. Is that a fair way to describe it?
That's right. That's right, Alva. The only nuance is that, unlike CRRs, which are strictly a financial tool, this option, it provides a CRR-like allocation, but it doesn't impact the physical rights that parties may hold under the OAT. They can still schedule that in the way that they see fit, receive the priority associated with the exercise of OAT rights. This is just providing that financial entitlement, and it doesn't create a CRR mechanism in that it removes the physical OAT rights. They keep it, they can exercise it, but this gives that financial entitlement.
Right. I mean, of course, people can exercise the right to self-schedule anywhere.
That's
the model will calculate what the congestion is in the EDAM market. So right. Basically, but the idea is that this may provide essentially the BAA with some either more or less revenue based on that on those defined instruments that could then the BAA can then decide how it wants to actually provide those revenues to the holders of the OAT rights.
That's right. And as we've noted before, this option potentially, to the extent that stakeholders wanted to explore that, does provide the ability, because the nominations occur individually, does provide the ability to potentially for the market operator to settle directly on those entitlements. Right, but it doesn't foreclose the option to continue to do that through the EDAM entity, and then the EDAM entity passes that through based on their oath.
Yeah, I got that very helpfully from what James said. So I think I'm getting it now. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Al.
Next, we have a question from Steve Keen.
Steve Keen from Medicine. This is just to help my understanding. It seems like what happens on the EDAM entity side is they sell their out transmission rights, and then this is just determining how much of the revenue would flow to it. On the CAISO side, are you envisioning a similar two-step process where the CAISO decides on the CRRs in like step one, and then the CRRs that are determined coming out of that CAISO process are put into this EDAM-wide single feasibility test to figure out how much revenue is potentially allocated to them? Or are you envisioning it as a one-step process where all of the CAISO entities put in their own nominations or allocations?
So Steve, what we do is we would have the CR nominations, and then when we go and run the SFT, we would run the CR nominations and these entitlements together and allow the SFT to make a determination on the feasibility of those CRRs and then curtail as needed.
Okay, then what I'm having a little trouble understanding now is the CAISO process as it exists today is a two-step process. It's a multi-step process, but basically there's the allocation piece, and then it comes back and does it again for the auction.
Right.
How do those two steps fit in with the SFT for the EDAM?
So the EDAM would fall more likely within the first step process. They're all considered equivalent to a nomination since they bought the transmission rights, and then whatever's left over would potentially go for the auction. The question is whether or not the auction extends to an EDAM BAA or if we're going to limit the auction to the ISO BA.
Okay.
Yeah, and as it's currently envisioned, at least it's not envisioning the auction extending to the outrights, but again, if there's some desire for that, that could be considered, but.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time.
Let's go to just the next steps for those that are still hanging around. So the comments on today's presentation are due on May 22nd. Again, these are informal comments. We're not in a proposal stage yet. We're trying to get a better sense from stakeholders on improving viability of these concepts and what the stakeholders see as the more feasible designs to dedicate our attention to and future workshops. I think we can continue to evaluate these all together. And I think at the next workshop, we'll look to focus on discrete one or two designs so that we can delve a lot deeper into them. And then a subsequent workshop on the other design that we didn't get to yet. But these are informal comments helping us shape feasibility and evaluation of conceptual designs that will eventually then make it into a formal proposal based upon how what we shape out through the working groups. The next working group is scheduled for June 2nd. We originally had it at the end of May, but in order to give a little bit more time for us to review the comments, but also give stakeholders a bit of a break as well on a lot of things going on in May in particular, we pushed it out to June, and then in late June we'll have another workshop, and you know we can add additional ones as we need as we discuss these concepts and refine them. But at the next one, we'll review the stakeholder comments that we've gotten based on the May 22nd deadline. And then again, we'll focus discreetly on one or two of these concepts, and then in a subsequent workshop on the remaining one, to the extent that there's still continued interest in evaluating all of these. But we want to get in a more granular discussion, particularly as you saw today, we kind of gave a preview of some of the key issues that need to be addressed. to improve the functionality and viability of these, that there'll be opportunity in future workshops to discuss. I'll note as well that right now there's a lot of things on the EDAM initiative webpage, a lot of these initiative documents, BRSs, the business requirements documents, this intertie schedule. We're going to be creating soon here its own webpage dedicated for the EDAM Congestion Revenue Allocation Initiative. And so that's coming soon. That should make it a lot easier for you to find all the documents and provide comments on it. I see one more question from Alva. Let's make sure we take these questions before we close out.
Go ahead, Alpha.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
One thing that just occurred to me is, does the congestion revenue entitlements model, does that lend itself to any form of recognition of these network rights that have been brought up by the Energy Authority?
Yes, you mean NITS transmission rights?
Yes.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that a couple of slides ago. We'll need to figure out how to best model NITS transmission rights. I think a couple of slides ago on slide 34, I talked a little bit about one way that these could be modeled within concept number 3, but that's something that we'll want to get into in upcoming workshops as well. Is how do you model these NITS transmission rights point to point, and hopefully CRR stay the same without needing to change anything because we're kind of adapting aspects of its process. But how do you model these OAT rights to incorporate them into that SFT process, particularly network transmission, which has unique terms and conditions and unique uses limited by load? And so how do you identify the source and sink pairs effectively to nominate to model the NITS load?
But in concept, it's just getting the other EDAM BAA to define an allocation that it wants to put through this process, right?
Yeah, up to the load. And so it's figuring out the EDAM entity would need to work with it. Yeah, with its customers, with its transmission providers to identify out of the different designated resources, which ones does it want to nominate into this process up to that load amount.
But in a sense, it puts the responsibility over to the EDAM BAA as long as there's no evidence that that's taking advantage of essentially the process as it affects, for example, CAISO, CRR holders.
Yeah, at least as we're considering it now, that would be a role for the EDAM entity to nominate the appropriate rights into the process. So the EDAM entity would work with its customers and then provide a nomination from the EDAM entity.
Be interested to hear what the Energy Authority thinks of this approach, because it seems like a pretty flexible one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We also have a hand raised from Steve Keen. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, Steve Keen from Edison again. I just wanted to ask about the expected timeline for this.
Yeah.
Are we expecting to get to a solution for the 2027 CRRs, the annual process, or are you looking more for 28?
This depends on we're not pushing for finishing this up by August of this year. I think we're going to take 2-3 more workshops, working group meetings, just to define, see where are we coalescing around the structure of a design, and then move to a proposal. Ultimately, what we've said is, to the extent that we go with one of these longer term designs, we're taking it for decision in Q2 of 2027, and then implementation would depend upon the final structure of the design.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. And we did just receive another raised hand from Jordan Miner. Go ahead, Jordan. And we're still not able to hear you, Jordan. If you want to write your question in the chat real quick. We'll give it a moment for Jordan.
Yeah, well, while he's doing that, I think I closed out with this slide, but again, informal comments by May 22nd. If you need a couple more days, that's okay as well. This is to help us continue to refine these designs to the extent you can provide substantive input on, and you've got any ideas on how to tweak the design or you know, want to provide how to model certain things, that's also welcome in these comments. If you want to present your concept on any one of these or a variation on it, you're welcome to do that as well. But certainly feel free to reach out to us offline as well. Any kind of input that you have.
And Jordan did just send in his question in chat. He wrote, pulling off of Alva's comment, how will CAISO verify if a BAA is not over requesting in their congestion allocation nominations?
Well, you have, I think this is largely based upon the eligible rights that you define. Those rights, you know, point-to-point rights are granted via OASIS. The EDAM entity, you know, is nominating rights that have been granted, that have been registered with the market operator, so there could be some validations on that front. And then on this transmission, to the extent that the nominations are limited by the peak load, those are transparent load forecasts or load inputs across transmission providers and BAAs, that there could be some requests for that information as well. But I think there's different ways that we can go about ensuring that the nominations are up to the appropriate standards or requirements of reserve transmission associated with reserved rights of a certain duration and load information as well.
And we did just receive another hand from Alan Meck. Go ahead, Alan.
Hi, Alan Meck, PG&E. How would this, sorry, can we go back a little bit? The SFT, how would it work would someone be able to nominate on someone else's system within EDAM? Or is that not allowed?
Well, so if we take the starting approach and as we've described it, it's each EDAM entity is the one responsible for providing the nomination within the process. So the EDAM entity for its own system would provide the nomination. To the extent that transmission customers have rights across multiple systems, those are different sources and sinks on each system. So you could have multiple, you know, different balancing areas representing the rights within their own balancing area. I hope that answers your question, Alan. But the EDAM entity would only be able to nominate rights, source and sink rights within its system. So a transmission customer that has rights across multiple systems would need to work with the different EDAM entities to ensure that their discrete rights on the individual systems are within the nomination.
Okay, what about transmission rights that they own? So I guess that makes sense for within EDAM. What about outside of EDAM? What would they do with those transmission rights?
So those rights, if they're outside of the EDAM footprint, market footprint, they would not be subject, they would not be eligible for this process.
Okay, so how would those customers be compensated in this framework?
They're not in the market, Alan, so I'm not sure what you would compensate them for.
Oh,
So if you're in,
okay. Right. I'm just thinking out loud, so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Okay, and I think I covered the next step slide. Just extend our appreciation to all of you. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions in between workshops or prior to the comments being due. If you have any questions that we can help with, clarify, or if you want to share perspectives or concepts that you want to vet, if you're interested in presenting, just feel free to reach out to us. We're always available, so don't hesitate to contact us. But with that, I'll turn it over to you, Christina.
Thanks, Milos. I just have some quick announcements here before we close out today's meeting. Here you can see some stakeholder meetings and comment deadlines that are occurring this week at the ISO. Here are some details on EDAM and parallel operations activities. And here's some details on market simulation meetings and business practice manual updates. And lastly, for insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. Here you can see some of our latest blog posts. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's meeting. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and all meeting materials are available on the initiative webpage. The video recording and comment template will be posted there soon as well. We thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.